So I'm very excited to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. Craig Alexander is a leading economist in applied economics and forecasting with close to 30 years of experience in the private sector. He currently runs an independent economic consulting practice. Craig has previously held positions as Chief Economist at Deloitte, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at TD Bank Financial Group, and Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the Conference Board of Canada. Craig is also the former Vice President of Economic Analysis at the C.D. Howe Institute. Craig is a passionate public speaker who travels across Canada discussing the economic outlook, financial market trends, and public policy issues. He holds a graduate degree in economics from the University of Toronto. Craig has written several studies on the importance of literacy, numeracy, and essential skills. He was awarded a Queen's Jubilee Medal for his work in the area of literacy. Craig has served on the boards of directors for ABC Life Literacy Canada and Frontier College, now rebranded as United for Literacy. Please welcome tonight's keynote speaker, Mr. Craig Alexander.
Thanks very much. What I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes is give you an economic discussion about literacy. Typically when I go out and I do presentations, I talk about where the economy's going, so we'd be talking about inflation and interest rates and foreign exchange, where the Canadian dollar's headed. But tonight I get to talk to you about another important economic issue, which is literacy. And you might think that that's a strange pairing, right? That putting literacy together with the economy isn't something that's typical. And yet, I'm going to argue that literacy is such a foundational skill set that it has profound economic consequences, and it has, and the state of literacy in Canada is costing the Canadian economy billions of dollars every year in lost potential. So this is an important issue. When we think about what's happening in the broad economy, you often hear about, what grabs the headlines is what's happening in financial markets and the high frequency data. But behind the scenes, there are tectonic forces that are shaping the Canadian economy and labor markets. The number one force that's changing the nature of our economy is aging demographics that I am sure you're all very aware of, and this has been a big challenge for the Maritimes in particular. But beyond the aging population, we have the impact of many decades of globalization. That means that workers here in Nova Scotia don't just compete with businesses locally, they compete with workers from around the world. And this has had an impact in the demand for different types of skills. When we look back over the last few decades, what we could see is that globalization was having a very significant impact in terms of shifting production away from North America in terms of physical goods. What we are seeing is more growth in the domestic economy in terms of services. Now, something interesting is happening, and that we are starting to see an element of deglobalization. We're seeing that in the wake of the pandemic and the disruption to global supply chains, the tensions with China, the tensions with Russia, that we are seeing increasingly businesses thinking about relocating capital closer to home. In America they call this friend-shoring, right? We could call it near-shoring, but what it means is that there's the opportunity for additional investment locally if you have enough workers to meet the demand that businesses have, and if those workers have the skills that businesses need. The third tectonic force that's been shaping the economy is the digital revolution. And during the last session, there was a lot of talk about AI. And there's been a perception that the technological change that we're seeing is creating a race against machines. That increasingly the AI could put a lot of workers out of jobs. I can tell you it is going to be highly disruptive to the labor market because it's going to change what activities and what skills are in demand. But at the end of the day, I'm not convinced that the technological revolution is actually going to lead to high levels of unemployment. I think our biggest problem is going to be labor shortages. Because of the aging population, I think there's not going to be enough Canadians to meet the demand that businesses have. But what will likely happen is the nature of work is going to continue to change. We've already seen shifts in terms of the shift towards more gig work, to more flexible work. This is the digital revolution having a disruptive impact on the labor market. It creates opportunities, but it also creates very significant challenges. Ultimately, I think that one of the biggest problems that Canadian businesses are having from coast to coast is inadequate access to labor. Labor shortages are something that business leaders in every province are talking about. And combined with that is the issue around the skills mismatch, whether workers have the skills that businesses need. So how do you deal with the tightness in labor markets? How do you deal with these sort of systemic challenges of inadequate labor supply? The answer is you have to figure out how to be more productive. Now, productivity has a very bad connotation. It's the longest four-letter word in the English language to most Canadians. Most Canadians think productivity means working harder or producing more with fewer workers. In point of fact, productivity is what drives a rising standard of living. Since the end of the Second World War, 80% of the rise of the standard of living of Canadians has come because we have become more productive. We have figured out how to be more innovative and how to produce more. And so the response to the labor shortages needs to be finding ways to be more innovative and more competitive and use our people to their full potential. The problem is that Canada has a significant productivity problem. In fact, if you just look at the last 10 years, the pace of productivity growth in Canada has been less than 1%. That's the slowest rate of productivity growth that we've seen since the 1930s. And this is part of the reason why Canadians feel like their standard of living isn't improving. In fact, it is. It's just going up at a relatively slow rate. And that means they don't feel like they're getting ahead. And that has its own set of problems associated with it. So we need to find a way to become more productive. Because if we don't, what we're going to see is that living standards will stagnate. So how do we solve this productivity problem? Well, that's an entire presentation on its own. Right? There's a lot of things that are having an impact in dampening Canada's productivity. Like a big one is weak business investment. Government regulations that are making businesses less competitive. But one of the big issues that we need to ensure if we're going to have a more productive economy is that we need to have workers who are resilient. We need workers that are capable of changing their skills and responding to market demands for skills. And that leads us to the conversation around literacy. Now, about 15 years ago, I was asked if I would do a research paper on literacy. At the time, I was the Deputy Chief Economist of the TD Bank. And literacy was one of the causes that the bank had identified in terms of providing financial support through the community giving arm of the bank. And the minute you think of a bank, you would think that the literacy was really about financial literacy. But the head of the community giving group, Scott Mullen, came to me and said, "Craig, can you write me a report on the state of literacy in Canada?" And I said, "Sure." But deep down, I couldn't imagine that we had a problem on this front. Right? I mean, we're a modern knowledge-based economy. Right? We're a G7 nation. We have a well-developed primary and secondary school system that actually ranks reasonably well on the international comparisons. We have world-class universities. How could we possibly have a problem with something so basic as literacy? So I went and I started doing the research, and I was astonished. The benchmark surveys that are done by the OECD, which is an international group that represents all the major industrialized nations, it's a survey that's done across countries, and it allows you to make international comparisons. And on the basis of their work, it showed that almost 5 in 10 Canadian adults didn't have the desired level of literacy to succeed in a knowledge-based economy. 6 in 10 didn't have the desired level of numeracy. Now, like you on weekends or in evenings, I'm sure you talk to your family and friends about the work you do, and I do the same thing, but I'm used to, the minute I start talking about what I'm working on, their eyes glaze over, they lose interest, right? Economics is dry, it's abstract, right? When I started talking to them about literacy and saying that, almost half of Canadians don't have the desired level of literacy to really succeed in a knowledge-based economy, their eyes didn't glaze over. In fact, what I got was pushback, right? Their response was, that can't be right. That doesn't line up with my sense of what the state of literacy is like. I can't believe that's true. Well, I started my career at Statistics Canada building economic data. I know a lot about surveys. And so I got a copy of the surveys the OECD uses. I went through the methodology, I dissected the data, and I can tell you it's rock solid. So as I thought about this issue, and I thought about the response of my family and friends, I had 3 realizations. The first one is that most Canadians don't know what we're talking about when we talk about literacy. Right? They actually think literacy is a binary outcome. You're either literate or you're not. That's not true. Right? If you actually look at what we're talking about when we speak about literacy, we're talking about the ability to understand, to create, to communicate, to compute using printed materials in a variety of contexts. Literacy is a skill set like any other skill set, right? So let's use the example of a piano, right? Some people haven't, like myself, have no idea. If you put me in front of a piano, I wouldn't have the foggiest idea what to do other than hit keys, right? I have no proficiency, right? Then there are people that have had a few lessons, and they can plink away, and maybe you can identify, what song they're working towards, but they can't play well. Then you have people that have actually learned enough that they are skilled, right? Then you have people who are what we would consider to be professional, right, in their capability, and then you have masters, right? So 5 different levels, if you will, around the skill set. Literacy is like that. It is a spectrum of proficiency. It's not binary. The second realization I had after talking to friends and family was that people with strong literacy skills can't imagine a world without them. People with strong literacy skills take those skills for granted. It's like breathing. They don't think about it, they just do it. And it's hard for them to envision what it would be like if they didn't have those skill sets. The third epiphany got me in a bit of trouble because I was doing a TV interview and I was talking to the reporter, and the reporter was really pushing me on this subject and said, basically the same sort of reaction, pushback that, it can't really be that bad. And I said, hey, look, I've got family members who don't meet the desired level of literacy to succeed in today's modern labor markets. Well, you can sort of anticipate what's going to happen, right? So I come home from the TV interview, I walk in the door and my wife goes, who? Because it was people on her side of the family, right? And that's true. But here's the thing. Those individuals, They don't realize that their literacy skills are holding them back. They don't realize that their literacy skills are limiting their opportunities in the labor market. You have to be very careful how you broach this subject with people around improving their literacy skills. Because just like my friends who thought it was a binary outcome, telling somebody that they could benefit from improving their literacy skills, you get pushback. What's interesting though is it's different with math. A lot of people actually will proudly tell you they can't do the math that they did in high school, right? The same isn't true with literacy, right? People aren't going to admit that they have a literacy problem unless their literacy is very weak, right? So if you think about the categories, if we had 5 categories ranging from 1 being the lowest to 5 being a true master, right? In Canada, you have 2 in 10 Canadians are at level 1 and 3 in 10 are at level 2. The desired level is level 3 because it correlates to better outcomes in the labor market and better life choices. And the people in level 1 are the people that often do recognize that they have an issue, but the 3 in 10 at level 2, most of them don't know that they're being held back. And when we think about Nova Scotia, just to, I've been talking about this from a national perspective. From the point of view of Nova Scotia's scores are a smidgen better than the national average on literacy, but it's very small. It's basically, Nova Scotia is right in the middle of the pack amongst the provinces. And on numeracy, Nova Scotia is, Canada is well below the average of industrialized countries, and Nova Scotia is below the average on numeracy. So what I'm talking about is highly relevant in the local area. The thing about it is, when you look at what literacy does, I fundamentally view it as a huge enabler. It enables you to accomplish so much more. People with stronger literacy skills are more likely to complete high school, they're more likely to go on to post-secondary education, they're more likely to graduate from post-secondary education. They're also more likely to do continuing learning, right? Statistically, far more likely to upgrade their skills later in life because they have the ability, they have the foundation upon which they can then build those skills. When we look at the data, what we can see is that stronger literacy increases your employability, it decreases your odds of being unemployed, but most importantly, if you lose your job, going from level 2 to level 3, which is the statistically desired level, right, the one that correlates to better outcomes, your duration of unemployment drops in half if you have the desired level of literacy to function in a modern economy, right? In other words, the world is going to be disruptive. The labor markets are not, we're not in a world where people graduate from school, get a job at, a business, and they stay there their whole lives, right? Workers are going to change jobs, change employers. That means you're constantly learning. When you look at the jobs that become available, the higher your literacy, the stronger your literacy skills, the better quality jobs that become available. And and there's a lot of jobs out there that people don't realize how important literacy is to actually getting that employment. So a good example of this was the CEO of ABC Life Literacy Canada that I was on the board of. The CEO met a young man who was going through a welding program. Now, a welding program has a big component of apprenticeship to it, right? He's going to be, taught on the job, but there's still book learning that has to be involved. And in fact, he shared with her the textbook, and it was 450 pages in terms of the primer that he had to know before and pass before he could then go on and do the apprenticeship to do that trade. So in point of fact, any job that you have today, you are going to need literacy skills to really succeed. And all of this translates into a better income. Right? If you go from level 1 to level 4, you double your income. If you go from level 2 to level 3, going from below desired to just desired level of literacy, just strengthening that much gives you a pickup in your income of about $8,000 a year compounded over your life. The compounding is important. It ends up being a huge positive return on the investment. We've also seen that in terms of looking at surveys of literacy scores and the outcomes individuals have, what we find is that people with better literacy skills make better life choices. Right? So people with stronger literacy skills have generally better health outcomes, partly because they become more aware of what are the things that are good for them. Right? In terms of political engagement, right? People are always complaining about voter turnout. Turns out people with higher literacy skills are more likely to vote. They're also more likely to volunteer. Right? You think about the labor shortages that we're having right now for businesses. Well, I'll tell you, when you're having broad-based labor shortages, it's really tough on charities that rely heavily on volunteers. Right? So by increasing literacy skills, what you can get is more engaged Canadians and Nova Scotians. The discouraging thing is when we look at the data, we haven't been seeing signs that literacy skills are actually improving. In fact, they've actually declined. Now, at this point, I have to be transparent about something. The last data point that we actually have is 2012. So the data is very old. And the reason for that is that there was a survey done in '94, there was a survey done in 2003, there was a survey done in 2012. In other words, the survey is done every 9 years. The reason being that, you know, your literacy skills aren't going to change in 12 months, right? So the survey is only done every 9 years. The last one should have come out in 2021, but that was during the pandemic, right? So I am keenly awaiting the 2021 data, but I'll tell you that I actually expect a decline. And part of the reason I expect to see a decline in Canada's literacy scores isn't because governments aren't trying to upskill the population and aren't investing in skills training. In fact, we've seen governments across Canada putting more emphasis on critical skills training. So the bigger issue is because of an aging population, what's happening is more of our population growth is coming from newcomers. And increasingly, we are getting newcomers, immigrants, coming from countries where English and French isn't their first language. And when I talk about literacy, what I'm talking about is proficiency in one of Canada's official languages, English or French. Often, people are coming to Canada who are highly literate in their mother tongue, but they aren't as strong in English or in French, and it's contributing to some of the underemployment and lack of engagement that we're getting with newcomers, right? If it wasn't for immigration, the population of Nova Scotia would be falling because of the aging demographics. So as a consequence, as we bring in more immigration, it turns out that 6 in 10 immigrants don't have the desired level of literacy. Within the domestic population, in terms of Canadian-born individuals, the fastest growing population in Canada is the First Nations and Indigenous people. And unfortunately, their literacy scores come in weaker than the national average at 6 in 10. Again, often their mother tongue, they are very literate. The challenge is operating in English and French, and it's holding back their opportunities. So when we look at Canada, regardless of whether you're looking at the communities like the First Nations or if I remove the First Nations and newcomers, Canada still has a significant literacy challenge, with roughly 4 in 10 Canadians not achieving the level that we want. But we also have some segments of the population that are particularly challenged. And then when we think about this from a business point of view, it doesn't matter where the source of the relative weakness is. What matters is the composition of the labor market and the skills that workers have. And so Canada's going to continue to bring in newcomers because we absolutely need the contribution that immigrants make to Canada. But if we want to be successful as a nation, and if we want successful businesses in Canada, we need workers to have strong literacy skills in the official languages. Now, all of that's at a macro level. If I look at this in a micro level, in terms of an individual business, like why should businesses champion the cause of literacy? Well, imagine, I just finished my stint as the Chief Economist of Deloitte, so I'm a consultant. I come in, I've got a product for you. If you buy my product, you will increase output and profitability. You will lower error rates. You will increase the ability to do on-the-job training. You'll get a better team performance. You'll improve your labor relations. You'll have a higher quality of work, reduce time per task. You'll have better health and safety records, and you'll have better employee and customer retention. Are you interested in my product? All those things I just mentioned, that's what literacy does. The Conference Board of Canada did an in-depth study and looked at the benefits to businesses of having workers that had stronger literacy skills. So it meaningfully impacts the bottom line of businesses. I think one of the challenges for businesses is that if an employee needs to understand how to use a piece of equipment or needs to know how to do how to operate a particular piece of software, specific skills training businesses understand, and they're willing to pay money for training. When it comes to general skills, it's harder to see the direct payoff to the bottom line. But in point of fact, literacy has a big impact, positive impact for businesses. When we think about this in aggregate terms, like what's the payoff, right? Why should governments and businesses invest in this area? Well, if we raise the literacy of level 1 to level 2 and level 2 to level 3. So we basically scale up the weaker, we upscale the workers at the weaker end of the scale by 1 grade, right? And we give them the employment of the higher ranking. You would statistically create roughly 800,000 jobs in Canada. Stats Canada has estimated if you increase literacy by 1%, you increase productivity by 2.5%, and you increase income per person 1.5%. This is a really good return on investment. And if I actually summed it up for the entire Canadian economy, the estimate in terms of what weak literacy is costing the economy, it's more than $100 billion. So there is scope by investing in literacy to boost productivity, innovation, competitiveness, and address some of the big challenges that we have. Literacy creates sustainable gains for individuals, for businesses, for the economy, and for society. Raising literacy that lifts incomes. Disproportionately, the people with the weak literacy skills are at the lower end of the income scale. Programs designed to boost literacy help to reduce income inequality. They help to reduce poverty. In fact, I put it to you, I bet you can't come up with a pressing Canadian policy challenge that improving literacy wouldn't help move the needle on. It might not solve it, but I guarantee you that improving literacy would help alleviate almost any problem that you mentioned. It is that foundational a subject matter. So the bottom line is that I thank you very much for supporting Literacy Nova Scotia. This is an important issue. I hope that maybe some of the comments that I've provided tonight give you some ammunition for when you're having conversations with others around why literacy is important, and help articulate the rationale for why Canadians and Nova Scotians should look to support better literacy outcomes. So thank you for your time and attention.